What happens when the nation that once drew borders in Africa cannot even draw a budget line at home? On the 9th of September 2025, the French National Assembly delivered a verdict that shattered illusions. 464 voices thundered against Prime Minister François Beu, tearing down his austerity budget and forcing his resignation. A government collapsed, a president stood cornered, and the whispers in Paris all traced back to the very continent France once claimed as its stage. For decades, France wrapped itself in the myth of stability, parading itself as the steady hand while pointing at Africa as fragile. But as the tricolor trembled in Paris, a mirror cracked. The empire that lectured others on democracy now stumbles over its own. This was not just about numbers. It was about dignity lost and sovereignty reclaimed. Not in Europe, but in Africa. Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and keep watching. Because the fall of François Beu was not born inside the marble halls of Paris alone. Its roots stretch far beyond the Seine, into the red soils of Africa. On the 9th of September 2025, the mask of French stability slipped. The chamber of the National Assembly, with its marble columns and ceremonial gravitas, became the theater of a political unraveling. Prime Minister François Beu had staked his survival on a budget that promised 44 billion euros in cuts. He declared it was discipline. The Assembly called it destruction. The vote of no confidence thundered across the chamber. 464 stood against him, only 194 in his favor. The verdict was clear. Beck was finished. This was not an isolated stumble. It was the collapse of a carousel spinning too fast to carry anyone safely. Emmanuel Macron had appointed 5 prime ministers since 2023. Each promised to steady the ship. Each was swallowed by the storm. Stability had become a mirage, conjured in press conferences but absent in practice. France was no longer a nation steering calmly through turbulent waters. It was a vessel patching leaks faster than it could chart a course. The irony cut deep. For decades, France had wagged its finger at African nations, branding leadership changes as chaos, instability, even failure. When Mali or Burkina Faso saw power shift under pressure, Paris shook its head with condescension. Yet here stood France itself, toppling prime ministers as though they were chess pieces abandoned mid-game. What the French establishment called democracy at home, it had called dysfunction abroad. The hypocrisy was as glaring as the headlines. Numbers alone could not capture the decay. The debt ballooned to 114% of GDP, a figure that mocked Brussels' fiscal rules. The deficit ran at double the European Union's ceiling. Yet these were not just digits in a ledger. They were signs of a deeper malaise. The French state had grown allergic to reality. Rather than confront decline, it cloaked itself in illusions of grandeur. The promise of austerity was dressed as a sacrifice for the future. But what future? What destiny could austerity secure when the very pillars of national legitimacy were crumbling? The carousel image was apt. Citizens watched a parade of leaders revolve through the Élysées gates, faces changing, promises recycled, but the ride never moving forward. A carousel may glitter with lights and music, but it goes in circles. It is dizzying to watch, exhausting to ride, and ultimately pointless. That was French politics in 2025. A dizzying carousel of instability parading itself as continuity. Beu's collapse was framed as a technical failure, a budget miscalculation. But strip away the numbers and what emerged was fragility. Fragility not of one prime minister, but of an entire system built on appearances. France's myth of stability had always rested partly on its projection of power abroad. The French state told its citizens that even if hardships existed at home, Paris commanded respect in Bamako, Ouagadougou, or Niamey. France mattered because it held sway in Africa. But as that external pillar cracked, the hollow inside the republic was laid bare. Consider the timing. As Beu fell in Paris, the African continent was already rewriting its relationship with France. Soldiers had left Mali in 2022. In 2023, Burkina Faso reclaimed control of its own security. Niger expelled diplomats and severed military ties. Chad, once thought untouchable, tore up its defense pact in 2024. Each departure stripped another layer of France's borrowed legitimacy. By the time Beu faced his assembly, the illusion that Paris still commanded Africa had already dissolved. The fall inside France mirrored the rejection outside it. One collapse amplified the other. Paris was losing abroad, and so it was losing at home. The parliament's arithmetic was not just political theater. It was the echo of Africa's defiance reverberating through French institutions. This is why the vote on 9 September was more than a budgetary defeat. It was a revelation that the Republic could no longer hide its fragility behind the veil of overseas power. The empire had become a house of cards, and the budget vote was the gust that sent them tumbling. And yet what happened in Paris was only the beginning. For as tear gas swirled in the boulevards and Macron scrambled to replace his fallen prime minister, another theater of confrontation was taking shape, far beyond the Seine, in the deserts and cities of Africa. But Beu's fall was not born in Paris alone. Its roots stretched far beyond the Seine into the red soils of Africa. The fall of François Beu did not remain confined to the marbled chamber of the National Assembly. It spilled outward, igniting the boulevards of Paris and the avenues of Lyon and Marseille. The budget collapse was the spark, but the fury in the streets was the fire. Unions marched with banners held high, halting trains and grounding buses. Teachers left classrooms. Hospitals staggered under the weight of walkouts. Ordinary workers demanded to know why they must pay the price for a government that had squandered its authority both at home and abroad. The austerity cuts meant frozen pensions, higher taxes, and dwindling wages. Yet the justification was always the same. France must tighten its belt to preserve its image. To the people in the streets, that image was nothing more than smoke. The hypocrisy was unbearable. For years, France had portrayed itself as the instructor, lecturing African nations that protests were signs of weakness. Yet here was Paris itself, drowning in chants, its air thick with tear gas. The images were almost surreal. Riot police charging through clouds of smoke, demonstrators scattering and regrouping, the tricolor fluttering above a capital that looked more like the very caricatures Paris once mocked. The collapse of authority was not just material, it was symbolic. France had built its legitimacy on the claim of stability. But in September 2025, the streets revealed the truth. Instability had come home. To African eyes, this was poetic justice. The same state that sent soldiers to Bamako in the name of order could not keep order in its own capital. The same leaders who scolded African nations for failed democracy were now toppling governments with the regularity of falling dominoes. The protests became more than demonstrations. They became a referendum on truth. Citizens no longer believed the rhetoric of empire. They no longer accepted the logic that sacrifices today would yield greatness tomorrow. The empire was already gone, and the sacrifices had no purpose. People saw the contradictions with clarity. Why should a nurse in Lyon or a factory worker in Marseille suffer pay cuts so that Paris could continue parading illusions of global power? In this theater of discontent, Emmanuel Macron appeared increasingly isolated. His speeches about resilience and renewal rang hollow. His insistence that France was merely restructuring its global presence was greeted with skepticism, even derision. The emperor, as the saying went, was naked, and everyone could see it. The international reaction only deepened the humiliation. European allies watched France stumble, unsure whether to pity or distance themselves. In African capitals, the response was laughter. Not cruel, but liberating. Leaders in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey openly mocked Paris's decline. They pointed at the streets of Paris and declared, "Your house is burning. Do not come to rearrange ours." And as the protests swelled, the cracks in France's facade widened. No longer could the Republic disguise its decline as democratic turnover. No longer could it point at Africa and insist on its superiority. The myth of stability was shattered, not by statistics, but by the roar of voices in the streets. Here was the paradox. France, a nation that had built its modern identity partly on the pretense of guiding others, could not guide itself. The carousel of prime ministers, the austerity budgets, the tear gas in the air, all of it painted a portrait of a republic staggering under the weight of its contradictions. This was the climax not of a budget dispute, but of a deeper story. The protests revealed what the numbers alone could not, that the French state had lost the confidence of its people. And confidence, once gone, cannot be conjured with speeches. It must be earned. But France no longer had the credibility to earn it. Not at home, not abroad. The question loomed like smoke above the boulevards. If France could not command obedience in its own streets, on what moral ground could it ever lecture Africa or anyone else about democracy and order? The streets of Paris had become a mirror. And in that mirror, France saw not a leader, not a teacher, but a fractured nation chasing illusions. As tear gas clouded Paris, another storm was already brewing thousands of miles south. A storm that would strip away what little illusion France still clung to. The anger in the streets was not fleeting. It crystallized into something deeper, a verdict on the state of the republic itself. When pensions were frozen, when taxes climbed, when families found their wages shrinking, people saw not just economic hardship but betrayal. They were told their sacrifices would preserve France's stature abroad. Yet abroad that stature had already collapsed. It was pain without purpose. This was the cruel irony of Macron's austerity. The promise was that by enduring hardship, France would keep its place as a global power. But France had already been humiliated in Africa. Military contracts lost, access to resources diminished, diplomatic leverage evaporated. The holes in the national budget were not random. They were the shadows of Africa's rejection cast upon Paris. Citizens may not have carried banners reading Sahel or Francophonie, but they felt the consequences in their bones. Every closed military base meant fewer contracts for French suppliers. Every rupture in the CFA franc system strained financial ties that once fed the treasury. Each rejection abroad translated into austerity at home. The French worker did not need to follow geopolitics to know the truth. They were paying for failures they had not chosen. Here lay the symmetry. As Paris lost control abroad, it lost control within. The two collapses mirrored one another. Africa rejected France's dominance, and the French people rejected their government's illusions. Both were acts of sovereignty, one by nations reclaiming independence, the other by citizens demanding honesty. The disillusionment went further still. Generations of French leaders had taught their people to believe that empire meant stability. Deploy troops to Africa, and France proves its strength. Host summits with African presidents, and France reaffirms its relevance. But when those props fell away, what remained was a hollow center. Workers began to ask, if France no longer commands abroad, why should we endure sacrifice at home? In this questioning, the role of Africa was not marginal. It was central. Leaders like Assimi Goïta in Mali and Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso had torn away the illusion with surgical precision. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was not merely a domestic affair in Ouagadougou. It reverberated across Paris. It told the French people what they already suspected, that their leaders were clinging to a fantasy. And so the austerity crisis became more than an argument over numbers. It became a referendum on France's very identity. Was the nation prepared to face reality, to accept that its era of grandeur had passed? Or would it continue to sacrifice its citizens on the altar of a vanished empire? The consequences stretched beyond economics. Politically, the Republic entered a spiral of mistrust. Parties bickered but offered no vision. The Assembly toppled prime ministers but produced no stability. Citizens marched but saw no response. It was governance reduced to noise, a cacophony without harmony. The symbolism was devastating. France, which once presented itself as the guiding light of democracy to Africa, could not even light its own path. Its authority had become performative, an act for cameras rather than a foundation for leadership. And once performance is exposed, it collapses under its own weight. To the people in the streets, austerity symbolized not discipline, but futility. Their labor, their pensions, their dignity were being consumed by illusions. They were no longer willing to fund the fantasy of an empire already gone. And this refusal reshaped French politics. The question was no longer how to balance a budget, but whether the Republic itself could command belief. That was the deepest crisis of all. For governments rise and fall, budgets expand and contract. But when belief evaporates, the foundation cracks. France was not just short of euros. It was short of faith. Faith in leadership, faith in institutions, faith in its own direction. And as the citizens turned their backs on Parisian promises, they were not alone. Abroad, the rejection was just as fierce. The two crises intertwined, one fueling the other, both exposing a truth Paris could not ignore. If Paris bleeds at home, it is because Africa has stopped feeding its illusions abroad, and that truth would soon echo across the international stage. The implosion of France did not go unnoticed beyond its borders. In Brussels, European officials tried to put on a brave face, framing Beu's fall as the turbulence of democracy. But behind closed doors, there was unease. France was not merely another member state. It was supposed to be the anchor of European credibility, the nation that projected stability outward. If Paris stumbled, what did that mean for the European Union itself? African institutions were even more candid. The African Union and ECOWAS issued cautious statements, but the symbolism was impossible to miss. For decades, these same organizations had endured lectures from Paris about governance, stability, and reform. Now, The teacher was exposed as the student who had failed his own exam. African commentators reminded the world that what was unfolding in Paris was not chaos imported from elsewhere, but collapse born from within. The geopolitical shifts were sharper still. Russia and China seized the opportunity, strengthening ties with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. New military agreements, infrastructure projects, and joint ventures replaced the void left by France. For Moscow, every African handshake was a signal to Europe. For Beijing, every railway or refinery was proof that investment spoke louder than rhetoric. The Sahel, once treated as Paris's backyard, was becoming the proving ground of multipolarity. In Washington, the reaction was mixed. On one hand, the United States welcomed the decline of French influence, which opened doors for its own engagement. On the other, America worried that the vacuum might be filled by rivals it could not control. The Pentagon eyed Russian advisors arriving in Bamako, while the State Department tracked Chinese capital flowing into Niamey. France's fall was not just a European embarrassment. It was a realignment with consequences stretching across the Atlantic. At the center of this transformation stood Burkina Faso. Its decision to expel French troops in 2023, to reclaim control of its gold reserves, and to anchor itself within the alliance of Sahel states was not just defiance. It was a revolution in sovereignty, a Burkina Faso revolution that shifted the balance of an entire region. The echoes of Ouagadougou's choices reached all the way to Paris, where policymakers could no longer pretend that dependency was permanent. To the international community, the collapse of Beu's government was more than French domestic politics. It was the exposure of a broader decline. France was shrinking, and in the spaces it once dominated, others were rising. The illusion of Paris as a global actor had dissolved into the reality of a multipolar world. And as Africa rose, Paris shrank into something smaller than it ever admitted. A regional power with a fading voice in a world that had already moved on. What then lies ahead for France and for Africa? The collapse of François Beu's government was not a singular misfortune. It was a symptom of a deeper transition, one that forces both Paris and Ouagadougou, both Brussels and Bamako, to reckon with a new map of power. For France, the horizon narrows. At best, it may reinvent itself as a mid-tier European power, influential within Brussels, but irrelevant beyond. The dream of projecting strength across continents has faded into speeches and nostalgia. Its currency of credibility, once drawn from its African presence, has been spent. Now the Republic must decide whether it can live with modesty after centuries of grandeur. Africa, meanwhile, is not waiting. The soil that once fed French power now feeds its own children. In Burkina Faso, the gold refinery capable of producing hundreds of kilograms each day is no longer a blueprint. It is reality. In Niger, rejecting the Francophonie was not a symbolic tantrum, but a deliberate step toward sovereignty. In Mali, partnerships beyond Paris are fueling national projects that once would have been dismissed as impossible. Each of these steps represents more than policy. They are milestones in a continent reclaiming its destiny. This new path is not without risks. Multipolarity brings competition as well as opportunity. Partnerships with Moscow or Beijing may carry their own dependencies. Regional alliances must prove resilient against both external pressure and internal rivalry. But the difference lies in choice. Africa is no longer living under terms dictated in Paris. It is setting its own terms, shaping its own bargains, charting its own roads. That freedom, fragile though it may be, is the foundation of dignity. For the French people, the road ahead is one of reckoning. They must decide whether to continue funding illusions or to demand leaders who embrace reality. The carousel of prime ministers cannot turn forever. At some point, the ride must stop, and the Republic must step onto solid ground. Whether it chooses to do so with honesty or denial will determine the future of its democracy. And for Africa, the promise is clear. The continent is not stepping into a void. It is building something new. Pipelines of trade, corridors of infrastructure, industries of value rather than raw extraction. Each refinery, each highway, each alliance is a brick in the architecture of sovereignty. So what happens when the teacher becomes the student and the student surpasses the teacher? The answer lies in the story yet to be written. Africa's story. France's crisis in September 2025 will not be remembered simply as the fall of a budget. It will be remembered as the moment when illusions shattered, when the Republic could no longer disguise its fragility behind the mask of grandeur. The collapse of François Beu's government was the symbol, but the truth ran deeper. France had lost the stage on which it once performed its strength. And in that same moment, Africa rose. Not in the shadows of Paris, but in the light of its own sovereignty. The streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey became the proving ground of dignity. The gold refinery in Burkina Faso, the rejection of the Francophonie in Niger, the alliances forged across the Sahel, these were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of creation. They signaled the beginning of a new road, paved not by empire but by independence. The irony is as sharp as history itself. For decades, France claimed to be the teacher. Africa was painted as the student, dependent and unstable. Yet the mirror has turned. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was not just a moment of rupture in Burkina Faso. It was a lesson broadcast back to Paris that sovereignty cannot be lectured, it must be lived. And as the continent built new partnerships, as it stood taller on its own soil, the Burkina Faso revolution became more than a regional shift. It became a beacon for others. For France, the verdict is harsh. The Republic may still hold weight within Brussels. It may still claim a voice in Europe's councils. But the age of commanding Africa is gone. The empire of sand has slipped through its fingers, leaving only the grit of denial. And denial cannot govern a nation. The deeper question remains, can France rediscover dignity and modesty, or will it cling to ghosts of power already lost? And for Africa, if one small, landlocked nation can reclaim its future, what stops the rest? If this story speaks to you, do not let it fade. Subscribe, share, and walk with us into the next chapter, where the echoes of the past become the foundations of Africa's future.